Today, we're going to be throwing on the wheel. Now, I've talked about wedging before, but when we're throwing on the wheel, wedging is even more important. Why do we need to wedge?
Air bubbles.
Air bubbles. Air bubbles cause what?
Massive.
A massive explosion, yes, they can. Now, when we're throwing though, they cause a different problem. They make it almost impossible to center your clay. So we need to make sure that we don't have any air bubbles. If you're pulling clay straight out of the bag, it's already been de-aired, and as long as you don't mess up the surface, you can pat it into a ball and then go straight to the wheel. But if you're unsure, if you're not positive that you don't have air bubbles, we need to wedge. So how many times do you need to wedge?
75.
75, good. So this is what kind of wedging?
Monkey.
Right, monkey face, because it looks like a monkey face. If you plan on learning how to throw well, you should learn how to spiral wedge, which is what I do. It's a little bit harder to learn how to do, but it's the same basic principle. You push forward with the clay, and then you twist it up a little bit and fold it over itself. $75. That's how long it took me to wedge 75 times. Okay, so it does not take that long. Once you have it wedged, slap it into a ball, and then you're ready to come over to your wheel. Okay. On your wheel, this is called the splash pan, and this comes off. When you're done throwing at the end of the day, you take this off, you pour all of the water into a slop bucket or one of the recycle buckets, and then you rinse it off, and you get one of the big sponges and you wipe down your whole wheel. It needs to be 90% clean at the end of the day when you're done throwing. Before you start throwing, you need to have a couple of tools. So you need to have a throwing sponge, you need to have a bowl of water, you need to have a sculpture tool, a needle tool, and a wire tool. And it's helpful if you have a couple of ribs. So I like having a flexible, thin metal kidney rib or a rubber rib. And depending on what I'm throwing, I might also have a wooden rib. Okay? The first thing that we need to do is make sure that the wheel head is clean. I'm throwing on top of a bat. You don't have to, and especially when you're first starting, it's not vital to have a bat because you're just going to be practicing. You need to throw about 25 cylinders before you're ready to start throwing stuff that you're going to keep. So when you first start throwing, it's really just for practice. You don't have to have the bat. The bat makes it easier. So if I threw a big vase on here, I'd be able to lift this bat up and then move it without messing up my form. But for practice, it doesn't really matter. So make sure that the wheel head is clean and slightly damp, but not soaking wet. If it's too wet, the clay is just going to slide around and it's not going to stick to the wheel head. We want to try and throw our clay as close as we can to the dead center. And then sometimes it's helpful to also slap center the clay a little bit. So if you just gently turn the wheel and slap the clay, it'll go more into center. When you start throwing, make sure that you put plenty of water on, and you're gonna push down and you're trying to seal the clay onto the bat surface or the wheel head. So I'm pushing really hard at first to try and just get it stuck on there and get it roughly centered. When I'm throwing, my whole body is flexed. My legs, my arms are braced against my knees and my sides. My stomach is flexed, my shoulders are flexed, because it's helpful to imagine that you're pushing all of the clay into an invisible little hole in the middle of the wheel. What you're really trying to do is just hold your hands still and stop your hands from moving around. Your hands are going to want to move back and forth with the clay. You're just trying to get your hands to stop moving and hold still, and that will force the clay to conform to your hands and become centered. I use this part of my hand on top to push down on the clay, and I use this part of my hand to push against the clay. Now, one thing that you'll notice, all the clay that we have has sand in it, which is good and bad for throwing. It's good for throwing because it helps give the clay more strength and body when you're throwing. It stands up better. It's bad for throwing because it's like rubbing your hand across sandpaper when you're pushing down on the bat or the wheel head. So if that bothers you, you can try and keep the wheel head as clean as possible, removing that sand, and it'll feel less like you're sanding your hands off. Once you have it roughly centered, we need to cone the clay, so we're going to squeeze it into a cone shape, and then we're going to push it over and down back into a ball, and we're going to cone it at least 3 times. This helps get the clay to all be going in the same direction, and it also helps wedge the clay just a little bit more to make it all even. So there's my 3rd time. Again, I'm just going to kind of push it over, and it'll sort of start to go back down into itself. And then I'll do one final centering. Now, when you're centering and when you're touching the clay, you never want to touch the clay unless the wheel is spinning. And you also want to make sure that you approach it slowly and pull your hands away slowly. If you're centering and you pull your hands away too fast, it'll throw it off center. So make sure that you do slow, steady, gradual movements when you're touching the clay. Once you have it centered, you're going to open it up with the magic spot. There's a magic button right on the top of the clay that once you start to press onto it, it will kind of suck your fingers down and pull them into the clay. So you want to stop your hands before you think you're going to hit the bottom, and then you're going to get your needle tool out and check how thick your bottom is. If it's really thick, then you need to go down more. If it's too thin, well, that's a problem. That's acceptable. That's about the width of your pinky, maybe a little bit less, and that's okay. Once you have the hole opened, you're going to pull your fingers. I pull them towards my body along the bottom so that I open up and make the floor of the pot. And then I'm going to go back with my fingers a couple of times and really compress that bottom. Remember, we talked earlier about compressing clay and it being less likely to crack if you compress it well. This is especially true on the bottoms of your thrown pottery. If you don't compress them enough, you'll get a cracked bottom, and nobody likes a cracked bottom. Okay, make sure that you are using plenty of water, and then for the first time, I use my fingers and the sponge on the outside, and I pinch it just a little bit, and I'm just pulling it into a short, squat wall instead of like a round donut shape. Every time I pull up on the clay, I always recompress the top because it's also likely to crack there as well. Now, what you're going to see what I'm going to do is I'm going to push in from the inside of the pot until I can see a little bump on the outside. And then I'll put my outside fingers underneath that bump, and then I'm going to pull them up together, and I'm going to lift that bump all the way up to the top. So I've already got a little bit of a bump there, and I'm just going to pull that slowly up to the top. And I'm thinking about while I'm doing this, I'm thinking about pulling the clay towards the center because the centripetal force of the wheel will make it want to go wide. So I'm going to try and keep it more in towards the center. So make sure that you use plenty of water, because if you don't, the clay will catch your hands. So I'm going to push out from the inside until I see a little bump, and then I'll put my outside finger underneath that bump, and I'm just going to lift to that little donut ring all the way up to the top. And even if it starts to feel a little bit wobbly, I'm not going to stop until I get all the way up to the top. And then I'll recompress the top. You only want to pull your wall 3 or 4 times maximum, and then be done. So I'm going to do one more pull, kind of even this out. It's a good idea to leave the rim a little bit thicker than maybe the rest, depending on the final form that you want to make. This is a basic cylinder. I'm going to make sure that I get the water out of the inside. Sometimes see it's kind of gone out wide, what you can do is put a little bit of water on the outside, and this is called collaring in. You can kind of gently squeeze all the way around and make the clay go back inward a little bit. But if you've got it too thin like I do right here, you'll just end up with a ripple. And then you have to kind of fix that ripple. Okay, the last step you're going to do is take the wooden trim tool with a knife edge, and you're going to set that along the bottom, and you're going to kind of stab into the bottom a little bit, because there's always going to be a little bit of extra clay at the bottom that you can trim off. Once we've got that, then we'll put a little water down on the wheel and take a wire tool and pull that water underneath a couple of times. That loosens the clay, and then I'm going to take my Spock fingers and pinch and slide it out to the side, and then I'll just slide my fingers underneath, and I can lift it up. And so you see it warped a little bit, but as soon as you set it back down, it'll kind of go back into center. So I would set it somewhere else and they'd be done. But what I want you guys to do for the first 25 pots that you throw is cut it in half, and then so you can see what the inside looks like. So clearly mine was way too thin up here at the top. Down here it was okay. I probably should not have pulled it that last time. I ended up making it way too thin, and this would have failed had I tried to keep it. Okay, that's it.